The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have a member of the House of Delegates with us today, Delegate Sam Rasoul. Welcome, sir.
Good to be with you, Woody.
We were talking earlier about your license plate number, which is 93 now, I believe. You started off at 99. How did you gain seniority so quickly as a new member of the House of Delegates?
When I was first elected, I was 100, but they didn't give me the license plate at first. And you had mentioned Ken Plum. He's number 1.
Right.
And so we used to joke that we were the bookends of the House of Delegates. And we've had a lot of turnover here the past year. We moved on up to 93, but my wife says it doesn't matter what your license plate number is, you still got to take out the trash the same. So
That's great. Tell us a little bit about your experience and background and why and how you got involved in politics.
Yeah, well, my background's in medical field. I've been worked with geriatrics for some time. The reason why I got into politics back in 2008 was my first run for office, for Congress. And I pretty much got into it because I really despise politics as usual. And so we ran a great race, won nomination, lost in a general, and I ran a couple more times, and the third time was the charm. And my wife again said the third time better be the charm, because that was my last go at it. But it was a wonderful experience, learned a lot. I feel as though I'm a much better citizen, and I'm excited to be able to serve the people of the Commonwealth.
Well, tell us some more about your district, for example, its boundaries, its demographics, and how it's doing in terms of the economy.
Yeah, Roanoke City, almost all of Roanoke City is my district, so minus just a few precincts. The economy is doing pretty well. We've had 1 or 2 announcements that unfortunately have gone the wrong way, but we have the second most diverse economy in the whole Commonwealth. So we're very fortunate that we're not too dependent on anyone. So things are going well, but certainly there are a lot of struggling families out there, and we always want to make sure we're providing a real strong voice for them.
So is there much diversity in your constituency?
Yeah, so my specific district has about 35% minority, about 30 of the 100% is African American, 5-6% is a variety of Latinos, some Asian Americans. So there's quite a diverse mix. In the city of Roanoke, there are 104 different nations represented, so we have quite an eclectic mix as we've seen an influx of a variety of refugees over the years.
So to what extent, if any, has the sequestration or the across-the-board cuts from the federal government had an impact in your district?
We're fortunate that we're not so dependent on federal government spending in my district as they are in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. So it, in general, has had a cut which has impacted much of the nation, but we're very fortunate that we haven't seen too much as far as the impact from that.
What about property values? We're still crawling out of the Great Recession, and of course that was one of the main factors that precipitated it. How have property values fared?
Well, we're fortunate in Roanoke that we didn't really see a bubble, so we didn't really have too many highs, and we don't have too many lows. So that's really the story of Roanoke. I mean, we're moving right along at a great pace. We've got great leadership, good city manager. Things have really been stable and going in a positive direction over the past decade. We're very pleased.
So what are some of the big economic drivers? I know that there's a relatively new school of medicine there, which is associated with Virginia Tech. I take it that's a fairly big driver in terms of economic activity.
Yeah, in addition to the Carilion Hospital Network and HCA Lewis Gale, the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine Not only is it a school, but there's also a research institute there. And between them both, that has really, we just graduated our first class last year, which is fantastic. That's really taken off over the years. So we're excited about the development that's around that, and more development that's been coming to downtown. Now what we want to make sure is that we have development all around the city in all the quadrants.
Now, I understand that the airport was recently renamed. It's now Roanoke Blacksburg. Is that accurate?
That's right. And bringing Blacksburg into the fold, I think, is important. We really, even though we're in the New River and Roanoke Valleys, I'm very excited about our new president of Virginia Tech, Dr. Sands. He's making it a priority of his to figure out what we can do to be bridging the gap between the Blacksburg area and Roanoke. We're certainly going to need to collaborate as much as possible in order to really raise both tides.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. If my memory serves me correctly, that research institute that you mentioned at the medical school is focusing on research on the brain?
Yeah, so which is really fascinating. One thing that I'm very interested in is early childhood development. And so some of the leaders in early childhood development are associated with Virginia Tech and Virginia Tech Carilion. And what we find is the most important part of a child's life are those first 5 years. So contrary to popular belief, I think that what happens with a child, that investment in their first 5 years is so important relative to what we do in higher education sometimes. And so their research there is really helping to not only study that, but study a variety of things.
And I understand the person who's heading that up is Michael Freelander, I believe, who's a real expert in that area.
He's not only a real expert, but he's got a lot of energy, and he has a real commitment to the area. So the Roanoke Valley is very lucky to have Dr. Michael Freelander. He and I sit on the board of the Science Museum together, and so he's wonderful to work with.
Now, what about rail transportation? I understand was it the Cambria station that was closed down at some point, and they're looking for a new site to bring rail from Roanoke all the way up to Boston potentially.
Yeah, we're fortunate that in the 2013 budget that was approved, we have appropriated funds to help bring Amtrak from Lynchburg to Roanoke. And so we're excited about Amtrak, bringing rail. I'm a big fan of intermodal transportation, any way we can get it. And we'll be able to literally jump on a train in Roanoke and take it all the way up to Boston. So it'll be very, very interesting for sure.
Now, you talked about the rationale for getting into politics was that you hated the way politics was being done. And I know that you have a proposal in the form of a constitutional amendment to create a bipartisan commission on redistricting. Tell us why that's so important and the impact that potentially could have.
Well, we're in the middle of an ethics session. Unfortunately, with our former governor going to prison for a couple of years, what we see with the Tobacco Commission, Senator Puckett, the Delegate Morsi issue, there are a variety of things that call into question people's trust in government. And what we want to do is make sure that people really trust the system. A republic is actually built and based on trust. And fundamentally, one of the most unethical things you can do is to draw your own districts. Voters should choose their politicians, not the other way around. And that's what we're trying to make the case here. What's most important is people don't understand when we have the gridlock in Washington and Richmond, it's mainly because of this kind of issue. We draw hyper-partisan, safe districts for Republicans and Democrats. Both are guilty. And then we elect hyper-partisan legislators. It's no wonder why we have gridlock in Washington and Richmond. So we have to fix some of these fundamental systemic flaws before we can actually make progress on a whole variety of issues like Medicaid expansion, balancing the budget, so on and so forth.
So flesh that out a little bit for me. What you're saying is then the primaries have become the real battlegrounds as opposed to the general elections?
Right. So my district in particular, I won with over 70% of the vote. It's very unlikely that my district or other districts similar that I'm going to lose in a general election. Most of these districts receive real challenges in the primaries. So that means that as a Democrat, I should stay as far left as possible. Well, that's not what I've promised the people, and that's not the way I choose to legislate. I think it's important, while I may be left-leaning, it's important for us to sit at the table and find ways to compromise. The people sent us here to do some work. And unfortunately, when we're so dependent on these primaries, it's no wonder why we continue to be in perpetual gridlock.
So how are you going to convince your colleagues to give up that very significant power, the ability to select who their constituents are going to be, and their ability to ensure that they will remain in office safe and sound?
Well, Woody, I thought you were going to tell me how that we were going to do that. But fortunately, we've got about 5 years before we need to take up the issue. But I think now is a perfect time to be able to address it, because we're in the middle of an ethics session. And as I mentioned earlier, voters should choose politicians, not the other way around. One of the most unethical things we can be doing is to say, well, I like this neighborhood and I don't like that neighborhood, let me cut them out of my district. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're not sidetracked with all this ethics talk of, should I take a $50 contribution, a $50 gift versus a $100 gift, $200 gift. All that is really smoke and mirrors. They want you to have that conversation, to send us off on a tangent, when really we need to be focusing on two things: big money in government and redistricting reform. And if you focus on these two issues, systemic issues, which we know are pretty big issues and tall tasks for sure, then we can begin to talk about really having systemic ethics reform, which is, I think, where the conversation needs to be.
I think a lot of people would agree with you that big money in government is a serious issue. The question is, how do you deal with it? Because we know there are a very small percentage of very rich donors, be they individuals or corporate entities, that get the ear and access to members not only here but in Washington, D.C., whereas you and I may not have that same access. How do you deal with that, especially in terms of our First Amendment?
Well, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations and other artificial entities, it is their First Amendment free speech right to actually donate through Citizens United, that controversial ruling. So the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional. So another measure that I've put in, piece of legislation, is to amend the United States Constitution. The states have the authority to call for amending the United States Constitution in order to ensure that First Amendment rights do not apply to artificial entities, that they only should be applying to the individuals, as which were, I believe, the Founding Fathers thought it should be. So, you know, certainly these are pretty big issues and can be very difficult. But if we don't keep the conversation there, then we're going to get lost in, I think, all kinds of smoke and mirrors.
Well, let's talk about some other pieces of legislation that will have an impact back home and statewide. I know you've got some legislation dealing with flashing lights on motor vehicles. It may not seem important, but I'm sure it is.
Well, you know, it is. First and foremost, it was my first bill that has passed, so I was hazed on the floor, received the ritual hazing. That was an idea that came to me from a constituent. So the constituents come to me all the time and say, I've got this idea, we research it. And what it is the Virginia Move Over Law, where we move over for police.
Yes.
This includes the VDOT Safety Service Patrol and some others when they're helping stranded motorists, to make sure that, you know, we're protecting them, because certainly they're putting themselves in harm's way. So it is very important to a variety of people, for sure. But most importantly, it's a great way to show the people that you have an idea, you want to turn it into law. We welcome that all the time.
What about your legislation dealing with the machinery and tools tax?
This is really the way I love to legislate. Here you have a progressive idea, which is using renewable energy, and a more conservative idea, which are tax breaks for corporations. And so what I would like to see is giving corporations and businesses a tax break if they invest in renewable energy. And so North Carolina has done it. They use 100 times more solar than we do. Why? Because they have great tax incentives. And I think this is a great way to bring together the left and the right to benefit both the business and benefit our environment as well.
Let's circle back to ethics reform, because whether it's a smokescreen or not, you're going to have to vote on a bill probably in the House of Delegates. And of course, Part of the debate will be how do you define terms? For example, who's a close personal friend or relative? What's an intangible or tangible gift? What caps may be necessary to place on gifts, and whether an administrative agency is necessary to help guide members of the legislature like you. Where do you see those issues coming out?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of this is certainly that needs to be defined. If that's the extent of the conversation, a lot of that really is smoke and mirrors. Two things that I'll be looking for, certainly I mentioned it before, bigger issues such as making sure we have proper transparency, but the big money in government. But secondly, of course, are big things like redistricting reform, which we wouldn't see that in an ethics bill, the way that they've been discussing it right now, but it's certainly very important. But specifically what we could see in an ethics bill is some kind of ethics body that has real subpoena power, that has some real teeth in it to keep us honest. And that's really been lacking up until now. So I hope that we, the General Assembly, will take it very seriously and find a way to have some kind of body to keep us honest.
Let's talk about education. I believe the General Assembly has indicated it would like to hold harmless, at least, to 2009 funding levels, K through 8, in our institutions of higher learning. What are you hearing back home from your teachers, students, parents about funding issues for education?
Yeah, and in Roanoke City, where 76.45% of our students are on free and reduced lunch.
76.45%. Wow.
And almost 5% of our students are homeless. We have 654 homeless children in our schools. We have a very challenging population. With that in mind, we need to do everything that we can to ensure that we retain and attract the best teachers, specifically in our region. So a variety of other localities certainly have their challenges, I'm sure, but we really see where it hits home. And recently there was an article that came out saying that teachers can't even leave the profession fast enough. They're looking for ways to get out as fast as they can because of the low pay and the difficulty in the environment, and then, of course, not being able to really teach. I mean, they're actually just training children to memorize facts so they can regurgitate it on a test. And unfortunately, it's meant to bring up the floor, but not help children reach their full potential, which is what our education system should be doing. So what I'm hearing is we're thankful that education funding is not a target, especially in these tough budget times. We also keep an eye out for cuts to local funding, not local education, but localities, because localities, two primary things that they fund are education and public safety. And so even if education doesn't take a direct hit, if the localities take a hit, they've got to pass it on somewhere. So those are some things we're keeping on, keeping on mind, the education reform as a whole, what we can be doing to improve it, but also just keeping an eye on general funding.
You mentioned these standards, and of course part of the debate that continues this session relates to standards of learning. You talked about teaching kids to just memorize or teach to the test. There have been some reforms as of last year. What else do you think is necessary?
Well, what's necessary is a complete overhaul of the system. I mean, No Child Left Behind really is not what we need to be doing. So that starts, of course, at the federal level. And I think that we have these anecdotes that help to craft this large policy. Anecdotes of students graduating from high school and not being able to read. And when we heard that years ago, people were frantic and said, well, let's come up with something to make sure that we bring up the floor. You know, essentially what No Child Left Behind does is it makes sure that we're not too dumb. It's not about making us smarter or children achieving their full potential, which is rather unfortunate. And there are a variety of other models that around the world that work better than our model. So in the long term, that's really what we need to be focusing on, a complete overhaul. And in the short term is trying to limit the amount of testing that we have, where we believe in accountability, but we want teachers to have the freedom to teach.
And I assume that accountability should be at the local level. There was a bill passed last year that has since been declared unconstitutional that would have allowed the state to take over a failing school. Now, everyone wants to help failing schools, but there's a way to do it. That issue, and also there was another issue, and I think there's a move to repeal the A to F grading that was passed last session. Where are you and your constituents on those two issues?
Yeah, so who wants to send their child to a D-rated school? So it's a bad idea. Even D-rated schools have A teachers. And you have the stigma attached, and then all of a sudden funding decreases because people are moving their students around. It's really a bad idea any way you look at it, running A through F grading schools at all. So I think that I know we've delayed it for a couple of years, but I hope we just repeal that altogether. And certainly in Virginia, I believe that the states shouldn't come in and take over failing schools.
Now, even though Virginia Tech is not directly in your district, Carilion Medical College is, and of course Virginia Tech has a huge impact on the region. Talk to us about the importance of Virginia Tech.
Most notably is the Virginia Tech Carilion Partnership, the medical school that we touched on earlier. That's important. And there are a variety of, Virginia Tech is a huge employer. People commute from Roanoke to Blacksburg on a regular basis, so we're very thankful for that relationship. And just the overall presence and the growth that we've seen there, I think, is great for the region. And I look forward to working with Dr. Sands, the new president there, and trying to figure out how we can bring our efforts together in Roanoke and Blacksburg.
Starting to hear complaints from students about higher tuition rates at our institutions of higher learning, of course, including Virginia Tech. How are we going to assist students and convince them to remain in the state?
Yeah, this is a pretty serious issue, and we need to figure out ways of making it more affordable. I'll tell you one thing that I am not in favor of that we're hearing this year is to have a different rate for students that are not looking for bells and whistles. Okay. There's this flat rate that people are talking about.
Right.
I think that's it's a bad idea. And the reason why it's a bad idea is because you're not taking into account the fixed costs that are associated with, as a former CFO, what happens is that the rest of the students, their tuition is going to go up if you do bring someone else's tuition down. Someone's got to pay for those fixed costs. While it sounds good on paper, hey, I'd like for the bare essentials, and I don't want to pay for all the bells and whistles, it really, from a finance perspective, is not very sound. We have to figure out what are some better ways of making things just more affordable for students through a variety of means, not only keeping the tuition assistance grant strong, which goes to our private schools, but also encouraging ways of collaboration through distance learning and a variety of other methods.
What about, I think there's a bill that the Majority Leader Kirk Cox has in which would cap fees, especially fees associated with athletics.
So that's the one I'm talking.
That's the same one.
Well, excuse me. There are two different ideas here.
Right.
And the one idea is the flat rate that he has spoken to. The other one is far more complex, actually, which is has a lot of merit to it, and that's relating to, if you want to grow your athletics program, you need to make sure you grow your athletics program by fundraising to grow your athletics program, not on the backs of the students that are paying tuition. That principally, I think makes a lot of sense. It's very complex and is being hashed through because you have different tiers of schools. The different tiers of schools receive a variety of different funding and a variety of different support. And so I think that we should take a good look at it because, as we know, college athletics is a big business, and we shouldn't have all the students carrying that burden.
Another controversial issue that is working its way through both the House and the Senate relates to sexual violence on campuses. And obviously that's something you're going to be faced with in terms of helping to fashion some type of legislative language. Talk to us about your concerns, the pros and cons that you see.
Yeah, I was proud to support Delegate Fillicorn's bill, and in particular it has a good balance to it. What you don't want is mandatory reporting. So if something has happened to a victim and they know that if they come forward that all of a sudden it will go public, they'll be less likely to want to come forward with their complaint. And so what we need to do is make sure we have a balance where we're able to have an aggressive bill that addresses this, but at the same time we don't want to put any roadblocks in the way for victims to come forward.
What about daycare? There have been some incidences in the past where children have not been appropriately handled, and there seems to be a need to regulate daycare providers even more.
Yeah, I think that's important for sure. We've had some unfortunate instances, but beyond, so that's really important, and I'm sure that they'll be looking into it. Beyond that is getting into early childhood development, and we have this wonderful program called the Virginia Star Quality Initiative. And what I'm encouraging parents to do is to look at VSQI, Virginia Star Quality Initiative programs, because they go in and rate some of these preschools/daycares, and there's a difference between daycare and preschool. Mm-hmm. And those that are really invested in your child will go through some kind of quality programming to ensure that your student is not just there and you're watching them, that in fact your child is growing in a variety of ways. And so I think this is very, very important, not just from an education standpoint, but what we find is that those investments decreases later on in life, exactly. Decreases crime, increases income, decreases teenage pregnancy, increases high school graduation. The key is to invest in that child before the age of 5. And it's kind of weird that our whole education system is built on investing in children after the age of 5. So it's counterintuitive, and it's a paradigm that probably just needs to be fundamentally flipped on its head.
Got about 30 seconds left, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the veterans in your district and the V3 program, Virginia Values Veterans.
Yes, there's a Veterans Care Center in my district that does very well. We proudly supported the expansion of the program to go into Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia. It's a great way to take care of our veterans. So we're excited about some of the new programs that are coming through. I'm part of the Military and Veterans Caucus, so we're looking at those issues very closely.
Great. Thank you for being here, Delegate Sam Rasoul. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.